The following is a community service presentation of KHON2. Pilot, Prisoner, and Patriot, the Jerry Coffey Story. Brought to you by the Navy League of the United States. Civilians supporting our military sea services. Whenever Jerry Coffey goes to Washington, D.C. these days, it's usually for a major speaking engagement, since motivational speaking is what he does now. But on those visits to the nation's capital, he always spends some time at the Vietnam War Wall of Heroes. 40 years ago, Jerry Coffey was an up-and-coming Navy officer, a fighter jet pilot, and about ready to go to war in Vietnam. Over 58,000 American military and civilian men and women lost their lives fighting for freedom in that Southeast Asian nation, and one of them was Coffey's co-pilot, Bob Hansen, his name inscribed in the black granite of this wall. Gerald Leonard Coffey was born in California, graduated from UCLA, and always loved the ocean. Shortly after college, he discovered airplanes and knew instantly being a U.S. Navy pilot was to be his lifelong career. In 1957, those two worlds came together the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida, when Jerry put on the wings of a naval aviator. By 1962, he and a few colleagues took our country out of harm's way with their photo reconnaissance flights discovering Soviet missiles in Cuba. They received awards and national publicity for those efforts. In the years following, the war in Vietnam began to expand with 400,000 soldiers and Marines on the ground in country. By 1966, then Lieutenant Coffey and dozens of other Navy pilots found themselves assigned to aircraft carriers flying waters off North Vietnam and flying missions into that very hostile communist territory. During the next several months, from the decks of the USS Kitty Hawk, Jerry Coffey flew 23 missions over North Vietnam, all of them routine, until that fateful 3rd day of February in 1966.
We taxied up to the catapult and went through all of our checks and got shot off into the blue and climbed out and headed for the beach. Somewhere in the process, about 4,000 feet of altitude, we took a hit. So I turned the aircraft back toward the Tonkin Gulf. The control stick froze in my hand stiff. I couldn't move it, and it became clear at that point that we couldn't stay with the airplane any longer.
Jerry regained control long enough for Bob and him to fire their ejection seats. Vigilante was still traveling at 680 miles an hour when they exploded out of the cockpit.
By rights, neither one of us should have survived, but we both survived the ejection. And he was killed sometime in the battle that ensued for our capture.
Jerry didn't know that at the time. He kept trying to account for his buddy as his captors dragged him from the water and began a 12-day journey on foot and in the back of a rickety old truck all the way to Hanoi.
My entire body was sore. I'd been beaten by the crowds in small villages and hamlets along the way, so I was really kind of a mess when I got there. Finally, after traveling for about 12 days, no medical care, we reached the outskirts of Hanoi, and that early morning continued on right down to the very heart of Hanoi and pulled up in front of this huge, formidable-looking fortress of a prison called Wa Lo, which in Vietnamese means fiery forge.